I'm talking about an ice age. We're talking about general temperatures that stay below the most severe winter you could think about all through the year. People living in caves and things like that. Okay, so that the business about Adam and Eve, there's no such thing as Adam and Eve. That's just a word. You know, we just give a word to say beginnings. But then you would have atoms, you would have a million atoms existing at one time. It merely means first type of man. Okay, but we're not talking about the very first emergence of a hominid. That's a man-like creature. Okay, we're really talking about the first emergence of modern man with the modern brain case. Okay, the reason why I say the European is not inferior because he happens after is because he's just a pink African at that stage. Later on, as people start to occupy particular zones, they would develop their own particular cultures and civilizations, etc. Okay, we're not talking about civilization now. We're just talking about the beginnings of man. Civilization is a slow process. And the Africans had a great advantage because they were to build the most remarkable of early civilizations in Egypt. Now, today what I'm going to discuss at great length is what was Egypt. How do we know it is African? Because it is no longer African. It is no longer African. Just like America is no longer American. There's no American in this room. We are all Europeans and Africans here. There are no Americans here. Native American is in the reservation, he's in Mexico, he's in the forests of Guyana, he's in all those places. We pushed him out. When I say we are now responsible primarily, but that is what happened. Okay, so that you have to understand clearly the different periods of history. We are really talking now about origins of man. And what we say, but now when we shift to civilization as such, then we start to deal with European civilization, African civilization, Asian civilization, to what extent these people drew upon each other. That's a much later period. But in this so-called Adam-Eve period, some people use that to show that one race is superior to another. We haven't found that. The close medical examination of humans have shown no race to be superior to another.
Okay, let me ask you. Piltdown man, would you explain what that was all about?
Well, now, you see, the problem arose much later, after the Europeans entered Egypt. Okay, after Europeans entered Egypt, they were very startled by African civilization. Okay, it was only much later that Europe, as it began to expand and it could not hold all of its people and people start coming down into Africa, etc., that you have the devastation of inner Africa, etc., and the assumption that the African was inferior. I'm going to deal with that later on. But the need to establish that the African was not the beginning of man, to establish that Europe was the beginning of man, led to people faking things, building fakes like Piltdown man, so as to make it appear that the European was first. It's not necessary, because being first doesn't make you superior. Because we all belong to the same human race. There are no races, really. If you take off skins, which are necessary, black skins, pink skins, brown skins are all necessary to cover your inner structures, okay? But the brain is the same. The brain capacities are the same. You may have people falling off in achievement because of psychological and social factors, not because of the brain capacity.
But specifically the Piltdown man.
The Piltdown man was used. These people built up a false man. Okay, we don't know who did it. Use it as a trick in order to show that man was born in Europe. Okay, that the first man was born in Europe and that Africans are later things. When I was a boy, for example, I went into the library in Georgetown and read that the black is only 10,000 years old. He's the last human being. You see, those things were necessary in order to keep the black down. Okay, you see, because after the conquest of the blacks, they could not, if they were taught to think they were equal, it would be difficult to control them. Because they would start massive revolts, okay? But once they felt they were inferior, they themselves would police themselves. They would not revolt. You would not need a gun or a sword. If you tell a man he's inferior and he really believes it, you do not need a gun or a sword to keep him down, because he would automatically look up to you, because he would think that he is inferior. So that it's easier to control him if you can build myths. And the Piltdown Man was such a myth.
Okay.
Again, how likely was it then that anthropologists, paleontologists, so forth and so on, could have made a mistake with the orangutan jaw and a human skull? How likely was it that that was an actual mistake?
No, you mean to say, is it possible that man did not come from ape?
Well, no, was it possible that they made that mistake and for some 50 years, Piltdown Man was a hoax and the so-called experts could not discover that?
That was very clever, you know, because those things were fused. That was very cleverly done. And you see, we did not have the kind of machines we have now. I could see right through your body. We couldn't do that when I was born. When I was born, there were no computers on the earth. Now there are more computers than people. I think it was in 1960-something, we reached that point, or 1981, there were more computers in the world than people.
Okay, let's go on. In the Journal of African Civilizations, you've explored African presence in different parts of the world, including Europe and the Americas. Would you just give us a brief survey of the African presence in some parts of the world?
Well, in Europe, the African did some extraordinary things. We find him first, on the first layers in Europe, we find the African. Okay, we have found skulls of African types in the lowest layer in Europe, the deepest layer, and then comes what is known as Cro-Magnon man, the European man. But that was very early stage. That does not concern us. But in terms of the African emerging in Europe, we found some very remarkable figures in Europe. We found, for example, there were 3 black popes. In one of my books, African Presence in Early Europe, you have Miltiades, for example. He was the pope because the Romans conquered a part of Africa, and in spite of racism, which was not as advanced as it is today, they allowed certain blacks to rise to the top. Okay, so that the Roman Catholic Church, there were about 20 to 25 saints in the Roman Catholic Church who were black. There are 3 popes who were black. In fact, the most important pope was Pope Miltiades. The Europeans did not believe in Christ. They thought that he was a fraud. They thought that was nonsense. It was not until Constantine, the time of Constantine, who was the emperor of Rome, that the Europeans were converted to Christianity. And the man who was the pope at that time was a black man, Pope Miltiades. And Pope Miltiades, Constantine, the Roman emperor, passed over the church to the pope. And initially Europeans worshipped the black Christ, because the Europeans were the Greeks, when they entered Egypt, they were so fascinated by African achievement because the Africans had jumped ahead, far ahead of Europe, not in all Africa, but particularly in Egypt, which was their high civilization. The Africans had geometry, Europe did not have geometry. The Africans had written the first books in astronomy. The Africans proved that the earth was round, Europe thought it was flat. The Africans had jumped ahead in medicine. They had a socialized medicine. They had made tremendous advances in medicine. They were the only people in the world to mummify. Today, for example, you could go back. I have a picture of an African princess in Egypt, 4,000 years old. And you could still see her hair. You could still see her eyebrows. You can still see her teeth. You can still see her skin. Nobody in the world mummified any creature for 4,000 years. You cannot find that in Europe. Only recently the Russians have caught up with mummification, and they mummified the wrong people, because now the Russians may have to burn Stalin and Lenin, whom they mummified. So that the admiration of the Greeks, the first Europeans, for the Africans was real. There was no racism then. Racism started to creep in with the Romans. And then later on, when Africa was conquered, then racism became rife because it was necessary to prove blacks were inferior in order to keep them down. Because if people think they're equal, they're going to fight you. If they're inferior, they're going to stay still. Okay, because they're going to take it as God's will that they should operate in that way.